you see this during like the political campaign too. I don't know if you remember the eating the pets. We had this very dramatic moment of
JD
eating the
Vance.
pets, right?
Okay, hi.
Yeah. So eating the pets was a rumor that emerged in a Facebook group where, again, a very real person, a woman who lived in Springfield, Ohio, and thought her neighbor's cat had temporarily gone missing, posted to a local Facebook group that was a rumor. Thought her neighbor's cat had been, eaten by her other neighbors, her Haitian neighbors, and posted about it, and that became an online meme, that became a blow up. And again, rather than being responsible, the good senator from Ohio, who was the vice presidential candidate at the time, chose to blow it up in the other direction and take a rumor and turn it into political propaganda because it served his interests.
Welcome to Thinkers on Times Radio, the show where we try and think of big ideas, have a bit more time to reflect, have a bit of nuance, and try and understand things that are shaping the world around us. Today's guest is Renée DiResta, an expert on how conspiracy theories jump from internet forums into the Hall of Powers. She's got a great book called Invisible Rulers. She's an academic. She has written about this question of how things in a sort of post-truth world operate. I suppose it's as straightforward or as not straightforward as that. Renée, welcome to you. How are you doing?
Thanks for having me. I'm great.
It's a great pleasure. There's so much to get into with you, because it seems to me that one of the things you're diagnosing is kind of the modern condition, the modern technological condition. So maybe let's start there. I was reading Victorian history, and they were moaning about the telegram, and they were saying it was going to ruin everything. And then I was reading about the radio, and they said it's going to ruin everything, and the television, and it's going to destroy family life and bonds and all forms of social interaction.
Video games.
Yeah, and every time there's this spasm of worry. And yet, to me, and many to people watching this, the world of social media feels different. Is it different? Is this just another technology we're going to get used to eventually, or is there something fundamentally different happening in our lives at the moment?
Well, it's funny you mentioned those other ones. There were pretty big seismic adjustments. This is a thing that I think we do forget, right? The printing press did give us the 30 Years' War. So there were pretty big seismic adjustments when those other things happened. There were pretty major adjustments that did happen alongside those. So we did adapt and we moved on from them. But there were oftentimes pretty major periods where we got used to the role that they began to play and how we made sense of the world, how we related to each other, how we related to authority, how we got information, how we made sense of information. So there's always that adjustment period. What is different about this one? I think what I would say is the way that people participate, that people are very directly involved. So in other communication technologies, ordinary people were much more still recipients of information as opposed to creators of information. So this one is much more of a we're all content creators now. We're all content amplifiers now. We are all constantly participating in the collective behavior of amplifying the things that we care about, the creators that we care about, the messages that we care about. And so in that particular sense, we've gone from maybe sitting on our sofas listening to the voices on the radio or the television, or reading the books, reading the newspapers, to being the creators ourselves, and to playing a very, very direct role in deciding what gets seen, what people pay attention to, and to making the memes ourselves and to shaping that information quite directly.
And at one level, that should be really healthy and positive.
Mm-hmm.
The time past authority was a dangerous thing. Very few people held it. As you said, the recipients of the information were effectively passive. They just had to live with whatever was being told them, whether that be the church or the state telling them how to live. And so this democratization of everybody being part of the content creation world, it should be at one level a good thing. And yet Everything that you write about, everything I've heard you say, flags a very serious problem with it.
Well, I don't think everything.
No. Okay.
I did try to be, in the book and in my writing, I try to be balanced. I do study adversarial abuse, so you do get the worst stuff from me. That's true. I think the points that I try to highlight are areas where we could do it better. So when I talk about, for example, social media algorithms, right? I write about the intersection of influencers, algorithms, and crowds. So the crowd is all of us, right? It's people who are just constantly there, relating to each other, sharing content, moving information from one platform to another. We're the people that do that. When you see something you like on Facebook and you move it to Twitter, or you see something you like on Instagram and you repost it to TikTok, you are the conduit that is moving information across the ecosystem. That's not something that an algorithm is doing. That's something that a person is doing. So you have that power, and that's an incredible power. You are deciding what somebody in a different ecosystem is going to see. Influencers are people who are doing this much more professionally, right? They've decided that this is something that is going to be, for them, something that they're going to monetize. They're going to earn money from it. They're going to earn a living from it, which means they have a very particular set of incentives. Their incentives might not be your incentives, right? They are actually incentivized in many ways to be sensational at times. And that's because they have to capture attention. They have to capture your attention, my attention, which means that they might not be necessarily motivated by telling the boring whole truth, but rather to tell a piece of the truth, right? That's no different than media in older periods necessarily, but there is still a motivation there that I think we all need to understand. And I think the way that algorithms operate is something that is also very, very distinct to this particular ecosystem. Whereas when we consumed media in the broadcast era, on radio, on television, on the newspaper, we were all largely seeing the same thing. When you have an algorithm that is curating content for you personally or for a niche of people who are similar to you, you are again creating an incentive. You are incentivizing a creator to make content that is going to be well received by a particular small group of people. And the algorithm is going to determine what that is. So the influencer is constantly creating content, not only for the human audience, but for the algorithm that is going to surface that content above all the other potential pieces of content in the world to that audience. And so the way that we behave is mediated so much by what those particular, unseen forces are going to surface. And it really does change how we relate to each other as human beings, because everything is mediated by what this unseen force is going to decide to push out to more people.
So in the olden version of the media, the media, and I'm part of the media now, and undoubtedly so, the media might distort reality, but there was a recognition, I suppose, that reality was objective at some level. There was some objectivity that the media either paid tribute to or distorted, but there was some normative set of values somewhere, some objective sense of what has happened or not happened. And you use a phrase, I think, called bespoke reality. And that is a shift, isn't it? So although a newspaper or a radio show might lie, it's lying in relation to the truth, and the truth is probably ascertainable. If you just follow an algorithm, if you just find people who agree with what you say, it's a bespoke reality, and you may be further away from the truth, and you may not even acknowledge the existence of the concept of truth.
Right. So the concern about propaganda or media in the 80s, the concern that Noam Chomsky was writing about when he wrote Manufactured Consent, was the concern that media would take the majority of people and move it in a particular direction. That there would be what he referred to as the hegemonic narrative, the idea that the media monolith, the mass media, would move the public in a direction that power wanted it to go. The argument that I make now is that you can't even really do that anymore. That there is so much a function of these small niche ecosystems, and that each is in competition at all times for the attention of the niche, that each of the influencers that is catering to a niche is in competition with all of the other influencers for the niche, that as each of them is competing for their small audience, you have realities that are sort of custom built for these small groups that are crafted to the sort of pre-existing preferences or identities or grievances of these very, very small groups. They're not even concerned about what the entirety of the public thinks or what a large portion of the public thinks. They're very much focused on what a very, very small group of the public thinks. So instead of focusing on what mass reality looks like, or how how you're even manipulating very, very large percentages of the public, it's really much more focused on creating reality or creating preferential messages for smaller, niche, identity-based, preference-based groups of the public. So the argument that I make is that the reason that it feels that reality is so fragmented is that because the incentive structures of this media environment make between the influencers and the algorithms, like they are driving people to produce content for ever sort of smaller niche groups of people. And that does create division purely because what you see, what you get outraged about, what you find truthful or realistic or compelling, or the people that you believe to be honest, the stories that you believe to be real, are completely different than the ones that I see and that I find compelling and that I believe to be real. And this comes into conflict when you talk to your friends or your neighbors or your family member who is seeing completely different things that are oriented to their identity, their belief systems. And that really does begin to feel very, very adversarial. I would have moments during COVID, when we're all sitting on our couches and nobody's actually out in the real world with each other, where people would say, friends of mine would say to me, "Aren't you so angry that this is happening?" And I would say, I don't even see that story. That didn't even make it, you're absolutely mad with rage about a thing that I'm not even seeing. This is not even on my radar. First of all, I don't know if it's real. Second of all, I don't know if it's true. And third, like, no, this, nobody I know is even talking about that. And it creates this very divergent, fragmented sense of no common ground on which we're standing. And that, I think, is something that when I talk about the challenge of coming to consensus, it's very much the feeling that we're not really knitting across these spaces anymore.
And actually, that there's a further problem with that is that no one recognizes the existence of the truth, or is suspicious of anyone who has a truth that is different to theirs. So COVID's a really good example where you get a group of people who think either vaccination is the worst thing ever, or COVID is part of an overarching conspiracy to shut down the world, to enable these shadowy people to control us. That's one set of beliefs, and they'll constantly see the same sort of stuff reinforcing their beliefs. Now, people on the liberal end of that argument aren't necessarily completely blameless either, because they might be being shared a narrative where vaccinations are 100% perfect and there's no risk to them, and actually we should all sit in our homes and lockdown should never be challenged. And therefore, neither side is willing to have any good faith to recognise that they might be wrong. And that's probably the problem, that no one's willing to admit in this world that they believe everything 100%. And if you believe everything 100%, you're probably wrong somewhere.
Right, exactly. And I try to make the point, there's a chapter in the book where I go into COVID, particularly, as I think I still count as center left. It depends where the center is. I think I get read as center right a fair bit too these days. But when you have that challenge of what I wrote about during COVID a lot in the U.S., the question of the institutions not speaking. Right, the void created by the institutions waiting until they had perfect information, the mask debate early on in COVID, before we even got to the vaccines, just this question of this feeling that they were leading from behind as people on the internet had a whole lot to say and the institutional authorities were silent. The way in which, as new information came out, there was a sense that they were always playing catch up, which led people to not trust them. You saw the social media platforms. This was Twitter in the sort of pre-Elon days, looking for frontline physicians to give blue checks to, so that they could amplify information from people who were not institutional authorities, but who were there, so they could say, "Hey, look, I'm a doctor. I'm working in a hospital in New York City. Let me tell you what it is like here." Right? Because they were trying to find voices who could push back against. This was during the days of COVID isn't real, right? And say like, no, it's real. Here is what my ER is like right now, right? Trying to find people who could tell credible stories, be credible messengers, and to put those voices forward so that they weren't necessarily institutional government authorities, recognizing that large numbers of people in the U.S. don't trust the government, and that, of course, flips back and forth depending on who runs the government. And so you would have that attempt to find credible messengers and to put those people to curate their content to help it rise to the top. But then, of course, when platforms do this, sometimes then they're accused of putting their thumbs on the scale, and this is the challenge of
which they probably are to a certain extent. I mean, the point is,
and that is, but this is another interesting thing. There is always a thumb on the scale, and this is something. This is what happens when you have algorithmic curation. When the newspaper is the same for everybody, you could argue that the thumb on the scale is the editor, right? And we all know that, and everybody is at least, and anybody with like kind of basic media literacy is aware that the thumb on the scale then is the editor, and the conservative paper has one editor and the liberal paper has another, and maybe we all kind of understand what we're getting at. But when you have an algorithmic curator, people don't actually understand to what extent that curation is happening and just how personalized that actually is, and yes, to what extent a ranking algorithm determines what you see. I think a lot of people don't realize just how many thumbs
Yeah.
are on those scales. And so I did try to get into that in the book. Like, there is no neutral when information is being algorithmically curated for you. The best neutral you're ever going to get is reverse chronological feed, and people don't like that, so they don't usually do it. They don't default to that. And trying to help people understand what that means is a challenge sometimes.
And I think that's such a good way of putting it, because there is no neutral, which is probably another word for objective. There is no authority, neutral, objective authority. It says, here are some facts. They're as true as they can possibly be, and we need to construct our own narratives around those facts. Instead, the very concept of truth has basically been lost completely. And it's probably time to bring in the spectre of Donald Trump and Elon Musk in all of this. When Donald Trump was elected his first time, he said, I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and still be elected. And I think actually Donald Trump's position has changed slightly, is that he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue in front of the entire world and say he didn't. And
right.
The vast majority of people who like Trump would believe him, because they would say there's a great conspiracy that put a gun in it. It's an AI fake. Someone put a gun in his hand. It's not really him. And this truly happens the other way. There's conspiracy theories on the left as well, but Trump is the person in power at the moment. And so we've got to a situation in America, and it's coming over here, where it doesn't matter what is true, because it matters what you believe. And if your gang believes something, they'll see conspiracy everywhere. Right.
No, it is unfortunately, it's gotten progressively worse. There's a phrase that we use here sometimes now called conspiracy without the theory, where there's not even an argument for why they would do something. You don't even need a justification for it. You just need to say, to say something in a hushed tone, and then, and it becomes part of a grand theory of the world. One of the things that we're seeing quite a lot of is the model of the revealed facts. I saw something yesterday that kind of floored me, which was some of these one of these accounts on X that goes and kind of hunts down databases now, and this one took it was Open Society Foundation, George Soros grants, which are public. These are public grants. They have been public for a very, very, very long time. And this individual took these grants, which were public, and she downloaded them all into a spreadsheet. And she announced that there was a spreadsheet that now you could use to go and look through these grants. And she made them, she sort of posted this to X, and they acted like this was just the most revelatory thing. And then somebody else said, she exposed them all. She hunted them down. And then funny enough, they said she made a database, and this person who had done this work said, well, no, it was in a database. I just scraped it and put it into a spreadsheet. And it was just the most extraordinary interaction to watch. It was literally it was in a database, but you had to check in with a CAPTCHA in order to get, in order to use the website. Now it's in a spreadsheet. And so, and just watching this dynamic of literally, we took public information, which has been public for years. But the fact that this person who gets retweeted by Musk a lot has now said that, I put it in a spreadsheet. This is now being treated as a revelation, and now you can go and see all the things that that George Soros has done in the world, as if you couldn't go and see these things previously.
You mentioned Musk there. Musk is the king of this, isn't he? Musk is the king.
Well, yeah, because then he does things like he tweets curious or wow or and as if and this is a person who should know better. Open data has been a thing for a very long time. All of these information, USAID grants, all of the various aspects of, we've had open data laws in this country for decades. Anybody who wanted to see open data grants could have gone and looked at any point. It's just that now the existence of government data is being treated as some sort of revelation. And we have the most incredible series of things that are happening in our country where people will find, for example, Social Security checks that are going to people in Ukraine, and they'll act as if this is a scandal, as opposed to the more likely explanation, which is that American expats who receive Social Security payments might happen to live in Ukraine.
Not very many.
And so rather than And every day there's a new blow up on Twitter about the most obvious things with the most obvious explanations. And we're just dismantling our government based on, based on the implied revelations of lines in databases that have been public for 10 years. It's extraordinary to watch.
Well, there's that example where they take a public fact and they put spin on it so it doesn't bear the construction. But there's also stuff where Musk, I presume, does this. I've seen him do this with Britain, actually. Some lunatic says something like there's an entire Muslim conspiracy to take over Britain. And then Musk goes, oh, is there? And kind of half endorses, half not endorses. So there's the taking of facts in the public domain and pretending they're secret. But there's also taking stuff that's just mad. And your defense as Elon Musk is, well, I'm a free speech guy. I didn't say it was true. I said it was interesting. But I wonder whether what happens in America, at least, because Musk is part of the establishment now, that type of, I think the phrase is posting, becomes policy. And the shift from people messing around on the internet to people messing around on the internet running the country is probably quite a significant change.
So there's, I've written about this a couple times now, in the Atlantic and on Substacks and things. There's a phrase that, tying it back to the media part of the first part of our conversation, we are the media now, right? Which was this, it was a phrase that came out of conspiracy communities. We are the media now was a QAnon phrase. And it was the idea that, we control the narrative. We have the power to control the narrative. And I said, that community is not just the media now, it's the government now, right? It has the it is the establishment. It has that power. It has the power to dismantle government, in fact. And that's exactly what we saw it do, where the pretext of those lines where, we saw the government grant database lines, for example, random government grants turned into like $50 million in condoms for Hamas was one of them. It was a rather notorious one. I don't know if that made it to the UK.
I've seen you write about
that, of
it.
course, was not a real thing, but these were the things where like they would go viral, and then of course the grant or the program would immediately be zeroed out, and then the entire agency would be eventually zeroed out, or we would have these people who were using them as pretext, essentially, to justify the kind of killing of programs they didn't like. So it was essentially exactly what you're describing. It is rumor as propaganda, right? That is the purpose of it. It is pretext to justify an action that, in a sense, the person or the entity already wants to take. It does incorporate the notion of the what I mentioned earlier, the public becoming actively participatory. When you have crowds of people on social media who participate in this process, they feel like they're uncovering something, right? They feel like they're engaging in a process of being active in government in a way that they never could before. For whatever reason, maybe they didn't know, or it never occurred to them that they could go and dig through government open transparency records. This is maybe something that they just weren't aware of, or they never felt like they had that pipeline right up to the person who was in power. Now they do. And so now they feel like they have this moment of empowerment where they say, look, I found this line item of $50 million in condoms for Hamas, which of course is not what it actually is. And you see the constant, incessant misreading of what they're actually looking at. Elon is the person who should know better. That is what the person in government is actually supposed to do, right? They're supposed to be the check on this. They're supposed to be the person who is responsible, who says, actually, no, that's not what that does. Let me explain it to you. That is what a responsible governance figure would do. But instead, because he's so much a part of it and he wants that approval, instead he goes along with it. And that's where you see that gap happen. So it's not that you don't want people feeling engaged and involved. It's that the problem is we have this almost like simulacrum of of governance here. You have this this like hall of mirrors kind of, twisting of what it should be, instead of people finding real fraud, waste, and abuse and saying, hey, can you do something about this since you are the government now? Instead, you have a process where misunderstandings and misinterpretations are either used as pretext, or they're similarly misunderstood, but the action is taken anyway. And we see this repeated over and over and over again now.
And do you think Trump particularly is very good at taking advantage of that. This idea that
Oh yeah. The social security payments in Ukraine, I think, made it all the way into, if I'm not mistaken, one of the state of it was I don't know if it was called the State of the Union address,
the
but a joint
Congress,
address to
we spoke,
Congress
yeah,
or something like that. Yeah, it was one of the joint addresses to Congress. So yes, because we saw this. You see this during like the political campaign too. I don't know if you remember the eating the pets. We had this very
yeah,
dramatic
yeah.
moment of
JD
eating the
Vance,
pets, right?
Ohio, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
so eating the pets was a rumor that emerged in a Facebook group where, again, a very real person, a woman who lived in Springfield, Ohio, and thought her neighbor's cat had temporarily gone missing, posted to a local Facebook group that was a rumor. Thought her neighbor's cat had been, eaten by her other neighbors, her Haitian neighbors, and posted about it, and that became an online meme that became a blow up. And again, rather than being responsible, the good senator from Ohio, who was the vice presidential candidate at the time, chose to blow it up in the other direction and take a rumor and turn it into political propaganda because it served his
And the
interests.
point he made, I thought, was interesting, Vance, which I think gets to a larger truth here, which is he basically said the fact of whether that cat went missing and had been eaten doesn't really matter because
Exactly. The story is what matters.
I'm using it to illustrate a story which is true, that we have an
Correct.
immigrant problem. And actually, I wonder, before we get back to Trump, whether the liberal establishment, this is true in this country as well, whether the liberal establishment has to bear some responsibility for this. If the liberal establishment were fully honest, if the liberal establishment were willing to talk about hard truths themselves, the desire for conspiracy to find this stuff wouldn't exist. So the problem of, I suppose, I don't know if people use the phrase political correctness anymore, but the refusal to talk about migration in an open way, including where there's problems with it, leads to a vacuum. That vacuum is then filled by people who want to only talk about the bad problems with it. Even if those aren't entirely true, they'll say, well, we're pointing to a narrative that is true, that migration can cause problems. And the people on the other side have let them do it by either not willing to confront difficulties themselves, or not talking, or being frightened of racism, or of being preoccupied with that type of problem. They've opened the gates, I suppose, for this.
I think there's a critique to be made about the avoidance of the avoidance of hard conversations, or a desire to simply shut it down and say there is no conversation to be had here. And I think that is there are, two things are simultaneously true. One, the right is very, very effective at taking a small grievance and turning it into a very, very big problem. And two, that yes, the left has chosen to avoid tackling, in some cases, hard questions by trying to say, "Oh, this isn't really happening. This isn't really a problem." I remember, I lived in San Francisco for 10 years and watched some of the narratives about, some of the narratives about crime was my personal sort of frustration, and having that personal experience of. Oh, this isn't as bad as people make it out to be. And I'm like, my car got broken into 3 times this year. It is.
Yeah, but they didn't want to say it.
And feeling like, we don't do ourselves any favors by turning that into something where it becomes oh, that's just something they're saying on Fox News, and when you bring it up, you're participating in the Fox News discourse. But so no, I think that, again, it's one of these two things are simultaneously true. The propaganda machine is very, very effective at taking something that is not caused by the thing that they are attributing it to, while also the pushback and the avoidance of the problem and the wanting by pushing back against the cause that they are attributing it to, saying no, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that. The actual conversation is not addressed in a way that makes the people who are experiencing it, who are having those feelings that the community isn't working for them in the way they want it to. It opens the door for that resentment, I think, that then lets that grievance come in.
And what we're talking about really, and what you talk about a lot, I think, is that somewhere along the line we've lost the sense of there are some things that are just true, and there are some things that are just false. And we maybe have lost the ability to arbitrate between those two things because we don't trust any of the arbiters. I mean, maybe this is just a consequence of postmodernism. Once you basically say we need to investigate everything correctly, intellectually, everything, we need to show the working of everything, we can't just take anything on trust. Once you sort of kick that door down, maybe we're living with the consequences of that. That if you can't necessarily say, I believe in these things, then it's very easy for people to assert anything.
I tried to make some divisions. And obviously, whenever you write a book, it's your bias in the book, right? And and I own that pretty clearly throughout. Um, there's a book that I really like by Benjamin Bratton called Revenge of the Real, which talks about. I was actually very envious of his title.
It's great. It's a great title.
It's a great title, isn't it? Because he's talking about the pandemic and the fact that the pathogen doesn't actually care whether you believe in it or not, right? There are these certain moments. I talked about it. I used to use the phrase tornado reality when I would give talks because I didn't know what we called this. I'm not a postmodernist, right? I am. My degree's in computer science, and and I did my philosophy undergrad classes where I would read these things and say like, okay, yes, reality is social constructed. I too have had my basic 101 and that stuff, and like, okay, but then the tornado comes for your house, and there is a reality there that doesn't give a shit if you believe it in or not, right? And so,
Yeah.
and that was the
Facts don't care about your feelings is the famous phrase.
right.
Yeah.
And so so I was trying to kind of differentiate between like how do we think about these things where there are these because there are the policy areas where we're trying to look at facts and make a determination about what is the best policy that we are trying to decide upon based on the sort of facts available to us. Those are the areas where you see people fighting about these things. The areas where, with, for example, COVID and what we're relitigating, I thought that we would see this interesting dynamic with COVID in particular, because I was looking at my research area during COVID was looking at vaccine rumors. And that was in real time, actually. And so we knew as we were doing that, it became very clear very quickly that there was not going to be a truth in those moments. Nobody was going to know what was real and what was not real as it was happening. And so the best thing that we could do was try to surface for the people who had the best understanding. For example, the public health officials, the doctors, the people who could at least respond to the public concern. This is what the public is concerned about. Now, that meant that they would have to actually respond, and that was where that fell down, right? They were not very good at responding to the public concerns, and that was where you saw the challenge of, okay, the public is concerned about these side effects, these things, these rumors, and there was this very huge asymmetry where the concerns were overwhelming. The influencers and the people who didn't have to be right at all were constantly talking. And the other people whose job it was to be authoritative in some way were constantly trying to figure out how to be authoritative. And they had a very different set of obligations there. And so there was this huge asymmetry between who had to be representing the real, if you will, and the truth and accurate information, while these other people could just do the big if true. I don't know. I heard this thing my friend said. And that's where you do see the challenge, I think, of trying to represent